The fastest way to lose everything is to believe your badge is more powerful than the truth. It began like any other quiet Tuesday morning, the kind that made the little diner on the corner of Maple Avenue feel almost timeless. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room. Bacon crackled on the grill. Silverware clinked softly against ceramic plates, and familiar faces greeted one another with warm smiles before settling into worn leather booths that had held decades of conversations. Outside, the early spring sunlight reflected off parked pickup trucks and family sedans, painting the sidewalks with long golden shadows as the town slowly came to life. Inside Booth 7 sat a man who looked like anyone else enjoying breakfast before a long day. He wore a neatly pressed navy blazer over a light blue button-down shirt, reading glasses resting near his untouched cup of coffee, while a folded newspaper lay beside his plate. His expression was calm, thoughtful, almost invisible, the kind of quiet confidence that never demanded attention, yet somehow earned respect from everyone who truly noticed. His name was Malcolm Carter, although almost no one in the diner recognized him. The waitress simply knew him as the polite gentleman who always thanked every employee by name, tipped generously, and never left before asking how everyone's family was doing. Across the room, an elderly veteran nodded toward Malcolm with a friendly smile, and Malcolm answered with the same quiet kindness that had become second nature after years of public service. There was nothing dramatic about him, nothing flashy, no security detail, no expensive entourage. Just another customer enjoying eggs, toast, and black coffee while reviewing notes before an afternoon committee meeting at the state capitol nearly 90 miles away. It should have remained an ordinary morning. It should have been forgettable. But sometimes history changes because one person mistakes dignity for weakness. The front door suddenly swung open, letting in a rush of cool air as Officer Ryan Walker stepped inside, wearing a crisp white police uniform that carried the confidence of someone who believed authority answered every question before it was ever asked. Conversations softened as several customers instinctively glanced toward the entrance. Ryan scanned the room with practiced suspicion instead of familiarity, his sharp blue eyes stopping almost immediately on Malcolm. For several long seconds, he simply stared. Malcolm looked up from his newspaper and offered a courteous nod before returning to his breakfast, unaware that a single assumption had already formed inside the officer's mind. Ryan slowly approached Booth 7, each step drawing the attention of nearby customers who sensed something changing in the atmosphere. The waitress hesitated beside the coffee station. A young couple stopped talking. Even the cook leaned slightly through the kitchen window. Malcolm calmly folded his newspaper and looked up with a respectful smile. "Good morning, officer. Is everything all right?" he asked in an even voice. Ryan ignored the greeting. His eyes swept across Malcolm's briefcase, his tailored jacket, the government folder resting beside his coffee cup, then back to Malcolm himself. Without offering an explanation, he demanded identification loud enough for the entire diner to hear. The room fell silent. Forks stopped moving. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to waiting lips. No one understood why the quiet man in Booth 7 had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention. Malcolm never raised his voice. He never argued. Instead, he looked directly at the officer with remarkable composure, as though he had witnessed this moment long before it ever arrived. "Officer," he said gently, "before you decide who I am, make sure you understand what you're really looking at." Ryan Walker didn't realize that within minutes, one phone call from the governor's office would transform this ordinary breakfast into the defining moment of his entire career. Officer Ryan Walker stood beside Booth 7 with the kind of confidence that came from years of believing hesitation was weakness. His hand rested calmly near the radio attached to his uniform, while his eyes remained fixed on Malcolm Carter, searching not for facts, but for confirmation of a conclusion he had already reached. Around them, the comfortable rhythm of breakfast had disappeared completely. Steam continued to rise from forgotten coffee mugs, but nobody seemed interested in taking another sip. The waitress, Emily Sanders, quietly lowered the pot she had been carrying and watched from behind the counter. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern. She had served Malcolm breakfast almost every other Tuesday for nearly 2 years. He always arrived shortly after 8 o'clock, always ordered the same meal, and always spent a few minutes thanking the kitchen staff before leaving. Nothing about him had ever suggested trouble. Yet now the room felt as though invisible pressure had settled over every table. Ryan spoke again, his tone sharper than before. I asked for identification. Malcolm slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them neatly beside the newspaper. His movements remained deliberate, respectful, almost impossibly calm. You certainly have the right to ask questions, officer, he replied, and I'm willing to cooperate within the law. The response sounded polite, but it carried a quiet confidence that unsettled Ryan far more than anger would have. He had expected excuses, nervousness, maybe even an argument. Instead, he found himself standing across from someone who seemed entirely unafraid. Several customers exchanged uncertain glances. An elderly woman whispered to her husband that the gentleman had done nothing except enjoy breakfast. A father sitting with his young son gently encouraged the boy to keep eating, although his own attention never left the unfolding encounter. Malcolm reached toward the inside pocket of his blazer with slow, careful movements, making certain every gesture could be seen clearly. Before his hand reached the pocket, Ryan immediately raised his voice. "Stop right there." The command echoed across the diner, causing another wave of silence. Malcolm immediately paused and slowly rested both hands back on the table. "I was retrieving my identification because you requested it," he answered without the slightest hint of irritation. Ryan remained unconvinced. Suspicion had already become certainty inside his own mind. Every calm response somehow reinforced his belief that something was wrong, even though nothing in front of him supported that conclusion. The officer briefly looked around the room and noticed several customers watching closely. Feeling dozens of eyes upon him only strengthened his determination to prove that his instincts were correct. Nobody questioned an officer who acted with confidence. That was the lesson he had carried throughout most of his career. Emily could no longer remain silent. Taking a cautious step forward, she spoke softly. "Officer, he comes here all the time. Everyone knows him." Ryan barely glanced in her direction. "Ma'am, please stay out of an active investigation." The words immediately discouraged anyone else from speaking. Malcolm looked toward Emily with a reassuring smile, silently thanking her for trying. Then he returned his attention to Ryan. "Officer Walker," he said after noticing the embroidered name above the badge, "I believe every public servant carries two responsibilities. One is enforcing the law. The other is earning the trust of the people." Ryan frowned. He had never introduced himself. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed his face before pride quickly replaced it. "You seem to know a lot," he replied. Malcolm nodded gently. "I've spent my entire life studying what happens when people are judged before they are understood." The words lingered in the quiet diner like a question nobody could answer. Outside, another patrol vehicle slowly rolled into the parking lot, its arrival unnoticed by most customers. Inside, every passing second pushed the morning further away from an ordinary breakfast and closer to a moment that none of them would ever forget. Officer Ryan Walker slowly reached for the handcuffs attached to his duty belt, convinced that decisive action would demonstrate control before the growing audience inside the diner. Every instinct told him he was protecting the public, even though nothing inside the restaurant suggested anyone was in danger. Malcolm Carter noticed the movement immediately, yet his expression remained remarkably composed. He looked around the room instead of at the officer, meeting the worried eyes of customers who had become unwilling witnesses to a moment none of them had expected. A little girl sitting across from her grandmother quietly asked why everyone had stopped talking. Her grandmother gently squeezed her hand but could not find the words to answer. The silence itself had become louder than any conversation. Malcolm slowly stood from the booth without making any sudden movement. He carefully buttoned his blazer, straightened the folded newspaper, and placed enough cash on the table to cover breakfast along with a generous tip for Emily. Even under pressure, He refused to forget ordinary acts of respect. Emily felt her eyes begin to water as she watched him prepare to leave his unfinished meal behind. She wanted to say something else, to remind Officer Walker once again that Malcolm had never caused trouble, but fear of making the situation worse held her back. Ryan interpreted Malcolm's calm behavior as calculated confidence rather than simple dignity. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," he instructed firmly. Several customers gasped. One businessman quietly pulled out his phone, not to interfere, but to document what he feared might become an important record of the morning. Malcolm looked directly at Ryan with steady eyes. "Officer Walker," he said quietly, "I want you to think carefully about the decision you are making. Every public servant is remembered eventually. The question is whether they are remembered for fairness or for assumptions." Ryan showed no reaction. His attention remained fixed on procedure as he repeated the instruction. Malcolm slowly complied, placing his hands behind his back without resistance. The metallic sound of the handcuffs echoed softly through the diner, startling everyone more because of what it represented than because of the sound itself. Nobody spoke. Nobody cheered. Nobody believed they were watching justice unfold. They were watching certainty overpower understanding. Malcolm lowered his head for only a brief moment, not in shame, but in quiet reflection. He remembered conversations from years earlier with young law students who had asked him how people should respond when treated unfairly. His answer had always been the same. Character is easiest to admire when life is easy. True character appears when dignity becomes your only defense. That lesson now stood before him in the most personal way imaginable. Ryan guided Malcolm toward the front entrance while maintaining a professional posture, unaware that nearly every security camera inside the diner had captured the entire encounter from multiple angles. Outside, the second patrol vehicle had come to a stop, and Officer Daniel Pierce stepped out, immediately noticing the unusual crowd staring through the restaurant windows. Before entering, he glanced toward Malcolm and paused. Something about the older gentleman looked familiar, though he could not immediately place the face. Back inside, Emily quietly reached beneath the counter and picked up the landline reserved for business emergencies. Her hands trembled as she dialed a number she had only used once before. It belonged to someone listed on a business card Malcolm had left months ago with a simple request. "If anything unusual ever happens while I am here, please call this office before you worry about calling anyone else." Emily had never expected to use it. As the phone rang, she whispered to herself, "Please answer." Across the room, Ryan Walker opened the diner door and led Malcolm into the bright morning sunlight, believing the situation was nearly over. In reality, it had only just begun. The morning air carried the scent of fresh rain on warm pavement as a small crowd gathered outside the diner, drawn by curiosity more than certainty. Drivers slowed as they passed, sensing that something unusual had interrupted the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood. Officer Daniel Pierce stood a few feet away from Ryan Walker, studying the scene with growing uncertainty. Malcolm Carter remained composed despite the handcuffs around his wrists, his shoulders relaxed and his posture dignified, as though he refused to allow the circumstances to define him. Ryan believed the silence coming from Malcolm was an admission that his suspicions had been justified. He did not realize it reflected years of discipline learned through public service, where emotional reactions often clouded better judgment. Malcolm looked across the parking lot toward the American flag, gently moving above the nearby post office. A faint smile crossed his face, not because he enjoyed the situation, but because he still believed the ideals represented by that flag were stronger than any single mistake made by an individual. Officer Pierce stepped closer and quietly asked, "Ryan, what exactly happened?" Ryan answered with complete confidence. "Suspicious behavior. Refused to identify himself. I am handling it." Pierce glanced toward Malcolm. "Sir, is that accurate?" Malcolm answered without hesitation. "I offered to retrieve my identification after I was asked. I paused only because Officer Walker instructed me to stop." His calm explanation hung in the air. Pierce noticed that it matched what several customers standing near the entrance were quietly discussing among themselves. Emily Sanders had followed everyone outside, still holding the cordless phone she had carried for behind the counter. She watched the display with anxious eyes, waiting for someone to answer on the other end. Every passing second felt longer than the last. A delivery driver who had arrived moments earlier walked toward another customer and whispered, "That gentleman does not look like someone trying to hide anything." Others nodded without saying much. The atmosphere had changed. People were no longer simply watching an arrest. They were beginning to question whether they were witnessing a mistake. Ryan sensed the shifting mood and straightened his uniform. He believed losing control of public perception would undermine his authority, so he spoke louder than necessary. Everyone needs to step back and allow law enforcement to do its job. The words created distance, but they did not restore confidence. Malcolm slowly turned toward Ryan. "Authority earns respect when it welcomes accountability," he said quietly. "It loses respect when it fears questions." Ryan dismissed the comment with a brief shake of his head, but Pierce could not ignore it. There was no anger in Malcolm's voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only quiet conviction. Suddenly, Emily looked down at the phone in her hand. The screen lit up. Someone had finally returned the call. Her eyes widened as she listened for only a few seconds before quickly saying, "Yes, sir. He is still here." She looked toward Malcolm, then toward the officers. "Someone important is asking for the supervising officer immediately." Ryan reached for the phone with visible impatience. "I will take it." Emily hesitated. The voice on the other end interrupted before she could respond. "No," the caller said clearly enough for her to hear. "Put the senior officer present on the line." Emily slowly handed the phone to Daniel Pierce instead. Ryan frowned, confused by the unexpected request. Pierce accepted the phone, introduced himself, and listened carefully. His expression changed almost instantly. The color drained from his face as he looked from Malcolm Carter to Ryan Walker, then back again. Whatever he was hearing was far more serious than anyone standing in the parking lot could possibly imagine. Officer Daniel Pierce remained completely still as the voice on the phone continued speaking. The parking lot, which only moments earlier had been filled with murmurs and uncertain whispers, now seemed suspended in silence. Pierce listened carefully, answering only with short, respectful responses. "Yes, sir. I understand. Yes, sir. He is here now." When the call finally ended, he lowered the phone slowly without saying a word. Ryan Walker stepped forward, clearly expecting support from his fellow officer. "So what is going on?" he asked with growing impatience. Pierce did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Malcolm Carter with an expression that had changed from curiosity to unmistakable respect. Malcolm met his eyes with the same calm composure he had carried since the beginning of the morning. There was no satisfaction in his face, no desire to embarrass anyone. He simply waited. Pierce finally spoke in a measured voice. "Sir, I have been instructed that we are to wait where we are. Someone from the governor's office is joining this call within moments." Ryan frowned. The governor's office? Why would they be involved? No one answered him. Emily Sanders quietly covered her mouth with one hand, sensing that the truth was beginning to surface. Several customers standing near the diner exchanged confused glances. A retired school principal who had recognized Malcolm from community events quietly whispered to the man beside him, "I knew I had seen him somewhere before." The man looked again at Malcolm's face, then his eyes widened as recognition slowly replaced uncertainty. Across the parking lot, another phone began ringing. This time it belonged to Ryan Walker. He glanced at the screen and immediately noticed the caller identification. It was the police chief. Confident that the conversation would validate his actions, Ryan answered without hesitation. "Chief, I have the situation under control." He barely managed to finish the sentence before the tone of the conversation shifted. His confident posture gradually stiffened. He stopped speaking and simply listened. The customers could not hear the voice coming through the phone, but they could clearly see Ryan's expression changing with every passing second. His shoulders lowered slightly. The certainty that had guided him all morning began to fade. Malcolm remained silent. He did not interrupt. He did not remind anyone of the warnings he had offered only minutes earlier. He simply looked toward the horizon, where the morning sun continued climbing above the rooftops, casting bright light across the quiet street. Finally, Ryan spoke again, this time much more softly. "Yes, Chief. I understand." He ended the call and stood motionless for several long seconds. Pierce carefully stepped closer. "Ryan." Before Ryan could answer, Pierce's own phone rang once again. He immediately recognized the official number displayed on the screen and answered. "Officer Pierce speaking." The voice on the other end was calm, direct, and unmistakably authoritative. "This is the governor. I need you to listen carefully." Pierce instinctively stood straighter. Every person nearby sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding, even if they could not hear the conversation itself. After several moments, Pierce nodded respectfully. "Yes, Governor. I will make sure it is done." Immediately, when the call ended, he turned toward Malcolm Carter and, without hesitation, addressed him with a level of respect that surprised everyone watching. "Senator Carter, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize for what has happened this morning." A wave of disbelief swept through the crowd. Emily closed her eyes in relief. Several customers looked at one another in complete astonishment. Ryan Walker stared at Malcolm as though seeing him clearly for the very first time. The quiet gentleman who had walked into the diner alone for breakfast was not an ordinary customer. He was one of the most respected members of the state Senate and the chairman of the legislative committee responsible for overseeing police accountability. In a matter of seconds, the assumptions that had shaped the entire morning collapsed beneath the weight of the truth. For several long moments, no one moved. The parking lot that had been filled with uncertainty only minutes earlier now carried a completely different kind of silence, one born from realization rather than confusion. Officer Ryan Walker stared at Malcolm Carter as though trying to reconcile the quiet man standing before him with the title he had just heard spoken aloud. Senator, committee chairman, public servant. The words echoed through his mind, each one dismantling the assumptions that had guided every decision he had made that morning. Malcolm remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, calm, patient, and composed. He did not demand recognition. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he looked toward Officer Daniel Pierce and spoke gently. "Would you please remove these? I have a committee hearing to attend in less than 2 hours." Pierce immediately nodded. "Yes, Senator. Of course." With careful professionalism, he unlocked the handcuffs and stepped back respectfully. Malcolm slowly adjusted the sleeves of his blazer, smoothing the fabric as though restoring order to something much larger than his clothing. There was no dramatic gesture, no visible anger, only quiet dignity. Ryan opened his mouth several times before finally finding the courage to speak. "Senator Carter, I do not know who you were." Malcolm looked directly at him. "You're correct, officer. You did not." He paused briefly before continuing. "But the more important question is this. Would this morning have been different if I had not been a senator?" The question settled over everyone standing nearby. No one answered because everyone already understood why it mattered. Malcolm continued in the same calm voice. "Justice cannot depend on titles. It cannot depend on recognition. It certainly cannot depend on whether someone important is watching." Emily Sanders quietly wiped away a tear. She realized those words were not spoken only for Ryan Walker. They were meant for everyone listening. Officer Pierce lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking. "Senator, the governor instructed me to inform you that the State Police Professional Standards Division has already been notified. The body camera footage and security recordings from the diner will be preserved for review." Malcolm nodded appreciatively. That is exactly how the system should work. Ryan looked increasingly uncomfortable. Every sentence reminded him that the conversation was no longer about one mistaken stop. It had become a lesson about responsibility. He cleared his throat. "Senator, I sincerely apologize." Malcolm studied him quietly. The apology sounded genuine, but Malcolm had spent decades in public life learning that meaningful accountability required more than regret. "Officer Walker," he replied, "an apology has value only when it becomes the beginning of change. Every person you meet deserves the same patience you would hope someone shows your own family." Ryan lowered his head. Around them, the crowd had stopped whispering. Instead of watching with curiosity, they listened with respect. The retired school principal stepped forward and quietly thanked Malcolm for remaining calm throughout the ordeal. A young father, standing beside his son, simply nodded, silently recognizing that the little boy had just witnessed a lesson no classroom could fully teach. At that moment, 3 black sport utility vehicles turned slowly into the parking lot. Their arrival drew everyone's attention, not because of flashing lights or loud sirens, but because of the quiet professionalism with which they entered. Men and women in business attire stepped out and approached with measured confidence. One of them carried a leather portfolio bearing the official seal of the governor's office. Another walked directly toward Malcolm with a warm smile. "Senator Carter," she said respectfully, "the governor asked us to make sure you are able to continue your schedule this morning." Malcolm smiled politely. "Please let the governor know I appreciate the courtesy. But before I leave, I believe there is still an important conversation that this community deserves to hear." The representatives from the governor's office respectfully stepped aside as Malcolm Carter turned toward the people gathered in the parking lot. The morning had begun with strangers sharing breakfast, but now they stood together as witnesses to something far greater than an ordinary misunderstanding. The sunlight reflected across the diner windows, where empty coffee cups and half-finished meals remained untouched inside, silent reminders of how quickly an ordinary day could change. Malcolm looked first at Emily Sanders, then at the families, the veterans, the business owners, and finally at Officer Ryan Walker. His voice remained steady, carrying neither anger nor triumph. "This morning is not about me," he said. "If it becomes only my story, then we will all miss the lesson." Every eye remained fixed on him. Even the passing traffic seemed to fade into the background. "Many people never receive the phone call that I received today," Malcolm continued. "Many never have someone important recognize their name. They simply go home wondering whether anyone believed them at all." His words settled deeply over the crowd because everyone understood the truth behind them. The representative from the governor's office quietly handed Officer Daniel Pierce a sealed envelope marked with the official state emblem. Pierce opened it carefully, reading the contents before looking toward Ryan with visible disappointment rather than anger. Department policy required him to speak clearly. "Officer Ryan Walker," he said calmly, "effective immediately, you are relieved of active duty pending the completion of an internal investigation. You are to surrender your department-issued credentials and equipment to your supervising officer." The words were delivered professionally, without humiliation or raised voices, but their meaning was unmistakable. Ryan remained motionless for a moment before slowly nodding. He removed the badge from his uniform and placed it carefully into Pierce's waiting hand. The small piece of metal seemed far heavier than its actual weight. Ryan understood that a badge represented public trust before it represented authority, and trust, once damaged, could not simply be restored by wearing the uniform again. Malcolm watched quietly, without satisfaction. He had never wanted revenge. He had wanted accountability. Ryan finally spoke, his voice noticeably different from the confident tone that had filled the diner earlier that morning. "Senator Carter, I cannot change what happened today." Malcolm answered gently, "No, officer. None of us can change yesterday once it becomes today." He paused before continuing. "But every decision you make tomorrow begins with what you learn from this morning." Ryan lowered his eyes. For the first time since entering the diner, he was listening instead of assuming. Nearby, a television news vehicle arrived after hearing reports of an unusual incident involving state officials. Reporters began preparing cameras, but Malcolm politely raised one hand toward the governor's staff. "I would appreciate it if no statements are made until every fact has been reviewed," he said. "Public confidence is built on truth, not headlines." The governor's representative nodded immediately. "The governor agrees completely, Senator." Emily stepped forward carrying the breakfast receipt Malcolm had left behind inside the diner. She smiled warmly as she handed it to him. "You forgot this." Malcolm looked at the small receipt and smiled. "Thank you, Emily. I suppose breakfast became a little longer than expected." Gentle laughter spread through the crowd, easing the tension that had gripped everyone for nearly an hour. It was the first genuine smile many people had shared all morning. Malcolm folded the receipt and placed it into his pocket. Sometimes, he said quietly, the smallest reminders become the ones we keep the longest. Ryan watched that simple exchange and realized that respect could never be demanded. It had to be earned one decision at a time. Standing in the same parking lot where he had believed authority alone would settle every question, he now understood that character was the only thing powerful enough to outlast a uniform. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but nobody hurried away. People lingered in small groups, quietly reflecting on what they had witnessed, as though they understood they had just seen more than an isolated incident. They had watched a moment that challenged assumptions about authority, fairness, and responsibility. Malcolm Carter thanked the representatives from the governor's office before turning back toward Officer Daniel Pierce. "Before I leave," he said, "there is one request I would like to make." Pierce immediately nodded. "Anything you need, Senator." Malcolm glanced briefly toward Ryan Walker, who remained standing several feet away, no longer protected by the certainty that had surrounded him earlier that morning. "I do not want this incident remembered simply because someone lost a position," Malcolm said. "If that is all people remember, then nothing meaningful has been accomplished." Several reporters who had gathered near the edge of the parking lot lowered their cameras and listened carefully. They expected anger. They expected demands for punishment. Instead, they heard something entirely different. "I want every officer in this department to receive additional training that emphasizes communication before conclusion, listening before assumption, and respect before authority," Malcolm continued. "Communities become stronger when trust is practiced every day, not only after mistakes become headlines." The governor's representative smiled slightly before making a note inside her portfolio. "I believe the governor will strongly support that recommendation, Senator." Malcolm nodded. "Good, because this conversation should continue long after everyone forgets my name." Ryan slowly stepped forward. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Senator Carter, I spent years believing confidence meant never questioning my own judgment. I understand now that confidence without humility can become its own blind spot." Malcolm looked at him thoughtfully, recognizing that truth is the first meaningful step. Ryan hesitated before asking the question that had weighed heavily on his mind. "Do you think someone like me deserves another chance?" Malcolm remained silent for several seconds, allowing the question to settle naturally. "Every person deserves the opportunity to learn," he answered. "But another chance is never given automatically. It is earned through consistent choices that rebuild the trust once lost." Ryan accepted the answer with a slow nod. There was no argument, no attempt to defend the past. For the first time that morning, he seemed willing to carry responsibility instead of avoiding it. Emily Sanders stepped outside, carrying a fresh cup of black coffee in a paper cup. She smiled warmly as she handed it to Malcolm. "You never got to finish your first one." Malcolm accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Emily. I believe this one will taste even better." She laughed softly. "Coffee always tastes better after the truth comes out." The nearby customers smiled, grateful that the tension had finally begun to fade. As Malcolm walked toward the waiting vehicle from the governor's office, a young boy standing beside his father called out politely, "Senator Carter?" Malcolm turned with a friendly smile. "Yes." The boy looked up with innocent curiosity. "Were you scared?" Malcolm considered the question carefully before answering. "Everyone feels fear sometimes," he said. "The important part is deciding whether fear will control your character." The boy nodded thoughtfully, holding those words close in a way only children sometimes can. His father quietly thanked Malcolm before placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Malcolm climbed into the vehicle, but before the door closed, he looked once more across the parking lot. Ryan Walker stood silently beside Officer Pierce, watching the car with an expression no longer defined by pride but by reflection. The morning had begun with assumptions separating strangers. It ended with a difficult lesson connecting an entire community. Sometimes justice was not measured by how loudly consequences arrived. Sometimes it was measured by how many lives quietly changed after the truth had finally been heard. 1 month later, the little diner on Maple Avenue looked exactly as it always had. The coffee was just as fresh. The booze carried the same familiar signs of daily life, and Emily Sanders still greeted every customer with the same warm smile that made strangers feel like neighbors. If someone had walked through the front door without knowing what had happened there only weeks earlier, they would have seen nothing unusual. Yet for the people who had witnessed that remarkable morning, everything felt different. Framed near the register was a simple plaque installed by the owner that read, "Every person deserves dignity before judgment." Customers often paused to read it before taking their seats. Some smiled quietly. Others reflected for a moment before continuing with their day. The words had become more than decoration. They had become part of the character of the place itself. Across town, the police department had begun implementing a new training program developed through cooperation between community leaders, experienced officers, legal experts, and the State Senate Committee chaired by Malcolm Carter. The sessions focused not only on procedures but also on listening, communication, impartial decision-making, and the responsibility that came with public trust. Officers were encouraged to slow down, ask questions, and remember that every encounter involved another human being with a story they might not yet understand. Among those attending every session sat Ryan Walker. He no longer wore a badge. He no longer stood at the front of the room with confidence built on authority. Instead, he occupied a seat among other participants, taking careful notes and listening more than he spoke. The experience had changed him in ways that could not be measured by reports or headlines. Pride had given way to reflection, and reflection had become the beginning of wisdom. During one training exercise, an instructor asked every participant a simple question: what is the first responsibility of public service? Different answers filled the room. Some spoke about enforcing the law. Others mentioned protecting the community. Ryan quietly raised his hand. To remember that every person deserves fairness before conclusions are made, he answered. The room became silent. The instructor nodded slowly. That lesson is difficult to learn, he replied, but it is one worth carrying for the rest of your career. Later that afternoon, Malcolm Carter visited the academy as a guest speaker. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no reporters asking dramatic questions, and no public ceremony celebrating what had happened. Malcolm preferred it that way. Real progress, he believed, happened quietly through consistent actions rather than public applause. As he finished speaking, officers stood to thank him for sharing his perspective. Ryan remained behind until the room had nearly emptied. He approached Malcolm with calm sincerity. "Senator Carter," he said, "I wanted to thank you for choosing accountability over revenge. You gave me an opportunity to become a better public servant than I was that morning." Malcolm smiled warmly before extending his hand. Ryan accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Never stop learning," Malcolm said. "The day we believe we have nothing left to learn is the day we stop serving the people we promised to protect." Ryan nodded. "I will remember that every day." As Malcolm walked toward the academy entrance, the late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the courtyard, reminding him that every new day offered another chance to choose integrity over assumption. Behind him, Ryan watched quietly before returning to the classroom, determined to earn trust through actions rather than authority. Some stories end when the truth is revealed. The most important ones begin there. Because a badge may represent power, a title may represent responsibility, and a uniform may represent duty, but character is the only thing that represents who a person truly is. And in the end, justice is never at its strongest when it humiliates someone. Justice is at its strongest when it transforms a mistake into a lesson that protects the next stranger who walks through the door. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.